Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual afternoon with Cheryl Diamond to discuss Nowhere Girl, a memoir of a fugitive childhood, published by our friends at Algonquin Books. Cheryl Diamond is now a citizen of Luxembourg and lives between there and Rome. Her behind-the-scenes account of life as a teenage model, or memoir, was published in 2008. Cheryl's second book, Naked Rome, reveals the eternal city through the eyes of its most fascinating people. To moderate this afternoon's conversation, we're joined by Ivy Pochoda. Ivy is the author of The Art of Disappearing, Visitation Street, and Wonder Valley, a Los Angeles Times Book Prize finalist and winner of the Strand Critics Award. She lives in LA. Throughout this afternoon's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of Nowhere Girl from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest to the virtual stage. Hi, Ivy.
Hi, Christina.
Hi, Cheryl. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you.
Well, hi, Cheryl. I'm so glad we finally get to do this after
Me
technical
too.
difficulties. I felt so bad. I did my whole book tour online, and I've been waiting for it to happen, and it did. And it turns out it's not so bad because we get to do it now. And
We
I had
just
more
got
time
to
to think
do
about your
it
book.
and get to know each other a bit better, so it's good.
Exactly. I was hoping that you'd open by reading a little bit. It's Cheryl's memoir is obviously pretty exciting, and I think the best way for to bring the audience on board is to hear your voice tell your own story. So I hope you'll oblige, and then we'll get talking.
Of course. So I'm going to read from the prologue of the book. And here we go. It's the simple mistakes that get you caught, not the epic dramas we imagine, a high-speed car chase or a helicopter spotlight pinning you in the darkness. Instead, it's the fingerprint on the edge of a letter, a call to your mother on her birthday, or a surreptitious visit home. Some of the cleverest fugitives in the world were captured because they thought it was safe to let their guard down, to breathe for just a moment. I learned all this in my years on the road with my family, decades of moving without warning from city to city, country to country, continent to continent. I memorized the mantra of Sikh prayers, how to add and subtract on an abacus, and how an internal combustion engine works. But my hardest lesson was something very different. I had to learn our rules. Always have a backstory. Rehearse it until it is your real story, until it comes without thinking. Never give outsiders your phone number. Never. Instead, set up an answering service in a different town where people can leave a message after the beep. Always check these messages from payphones. Make sure all mail goes to a P.O. box. Before picking it up, take abrupt turns, circuitous routes, with eyes trained on the rearview mirror, making sure there isn't a tail. Pay for everything in cash. Never own a credit card. And most important, when you leave a place, no matter how much you love it, no matter how many friends you've made, you can never, ever go back. You cannot contact people you used to know. Relationships have to go up in smoke along with the old documents. It sounds simple, but few people can do it continuously over many years. They get tired and careless or start to miss those they've left behind. And then, as Dad likes to remind us, you're as good as dead. That hallucinatory feeling of early dawn at the Golden Temple, the words of Guru Nanak chanting gently from my lips, is as smooth as a dream in my memory, but also as real as yesterday. Those moments in India, my father's warm hand on my shoulder as dawn broke over the Himalayas, were the first beliefs I developed and stored permanently in my heart. It was all somehow perfect, even the young soldiers armed with big guns, even my brother's fists going through the wall. Everything Dad promised seemed so easily within our reach. There was so much more I didn't understand, not then hurtling down a mountain, or later when Frank and Chiara turned into people I could never imagine. Nor on the last day I saw my brother. Not even today. But why did we run so fast and for so long? Why did we risk it all? That answer is simple. We were being hunted.
Well, thanks. I love the opening of this book. It goes from that moment into a really kind of horrific near-death experience, car accident. And it's just such a gripping opening. I'm wondering, just if for people who might not be familiar with the whole nature of the story, without going into too much detail, if you could just give us a brief summary of the nature of your childhood and the part of your life that's captured in Nowhere Girl.
So the book is the story of what it's like to be born into a family of outlaws who were fleeing Interpol and various other international law enforcement agencies before I was even born. And when I was little, it felt like one big adventure because we were traveling the world and trying to stay one step ahead from these people who were chasing us. And it seemed like a game, actually, to me, and it was presented to me as a game. So every time we changed our name and every new city, I had a new backstory that I had to memorize. And as I grew older, I began to realize that we were in a lot of trouble and that this was no game, or it was a very dangerous game. And then as time went on, I began to look at my own family instead of looking at the shadows that were chasing us. And that's when I realized that the biggest risk to me wasn't from outside forces, but from the very people who were supposed to love and protect me. But I realized that they didn't.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. That's a really interesting way that you summarize the book as the way the story changes, progressing through it. Something that I noticed when I was reading it is the sort of pacing and the style changes slightly from the beginning to the end. You start with this kind of long opening chapter or prologue that you read part of about this car crash, and then it's aftermath and some of the places you are as a young girl. I guess you're maybe, I can't remember how old you're in that section, 4 or 7, or
4 at the
you
very
have
beginning.
4, yeah, at the beginning, yeah. And you have a lot more time you spend a lot more time with like the built environment and the sort of beauty of those days. And then I noticed that the chapters were getting shorter as the book progressed, and things were sort of getting choppier and more fragmented. And I realized and I was like, I wonder what that's about. Though it works really well because obviously people, from a dumb craft perspective, like shorter chapters at the end of a book because they keep turning. But and in hearing your description of your summary of the book, it was so interesting because it does sound like as you came into awareness of what was really going on, your world perception changed, and that sort of mirrored in the structure.
Yeah,
were you conscious
exactly.
of that, or like okay?
I became conscious of it as I was writing. I didn't necessarily plan that out at the beginning. In fact, it was just this feeling in me that I had to write my story. And so I started writing it. And I didn't really have a clear structural plan or anything, but I began to see it appear naturally in the way that I was writing. And then I leaned into it.
Right.
So at the beginning, for sure, I wanted to capture that feeling of magic and wonder and adventure, because that is what I felt as a child, and that was my reality. And that's also why it is so shocking and surprising when things start to change later in the book, because you have a feeling, you have an inkling, even from the beginning, that something is off. It's not normal that we're burning identities and buying fake passports and running from these people. But I wanted it to be a natural progression and to have the writing style reflect how I felt at the time. And so that's why, for example, there's a big shift in the style you'll see when I'm about 14 years old in the book. and we're in a very dark place, and I have to save us or help us, hopefully, escape. And there it becomes much more street, the way rhythm is much faster, and the whole momentum of the book speeds up. And that there was a conscious decision, because I was already seeing how my style changed, also because it has to reflect my age changing from 4 to 6 to 8 to 14, and then later to myself now as an adult. So yeah, I'm glad you noticed that. Yes, that was intentional. It wasn't planned, but then it was intentional.
Yeah, I mean, it's the nature of memory too, of course. Like, so, and it's very hard to write a memoir from the perspective of yourself when you're 4, because you're, you have all this knowledge of what's really going on and how dangerous these things really are and how dangerous that car crash really is. But you do such a good job of sort of not hinting too much about what's going on and still letting us have that like childlike perception of wonder. Yeah, it's well done. I also thought that like, of course, being like American and finding America not particularly exotic, like the style of the book really changed when you moved to like Virginia. And I was like, oh, it was so cool before. They're always like really exotic places. Like now they live in like a ranch, like a American house in McLean or wherever. And I was
but
like,
you see, to me, that was exotic, because to me, I'd never had an experience. So that's also the funny flip in the book, is that the normalcy, or the very brief contact we had with normalcy, was to me very exotic.
Yeah, that does come across too, but the writing style, like for like an American reader, because you sound completely American when you talk, but obviously we know you're not. You've lived all over the world, or until very recently were a citizen of nowhere, which is a big part of the book. But that part, sort of like the tone, sort of, maybe it's exotic to you, but for me, I was like, this is where it starts to shift a little bit. I'm like, oh, now we're in a different space. And of course, like in America is where things start to become a little bit darker, and it makes perfect sense to me, so writing a memoir, you're young, younger than I am. And, writing a memoir at your age, or at my age, it's an interesting decision, because there's so much life left to be led. It's very complicated. I did a lot of editing of celebrity memoirs, and there'd be like 75-year-old actresses. And you're like, but what comes next? And like this idea that you're at the end of your life and looking back. But it's a 2-part question. Like, so why did you decide to write this book at this particular moment? And also, like, how does it feel to summarize one part of your life, knowing that there's so much more to come?
Well, I got made fun of a lot by people who would come up to me in cafes, because I like to write in cafes. And so they would ask me, what are you writing? Is it a school paper for college? And I said, And I said, no, it's a memoir. It's a book about my life. And so, of course, then everybody would laugh, and they would say, you're too young to write about your life. And I would just say, wait.
Yeah.
Because once it's done, you won't question me on that anymore, because I've lived many lifetimes, fortunately or unfortunately. And I decided to write it now. I started writing Nowhere Girl 10 years ago, actually. So it was a 10-year process. Yes, and a very difficult one, because to bring a story like this out of yourself, with all the struggle and the pain and the beauty, that's not easy. And I struggled with a lot. But the reason I decided to start writing it was because my story was something that really affected me. I would wake up with nightmares and then realize that wasn't a nightmare, it was a memory. And so this story was just trapped in me. Yeah. Go on.
No, sorry. It's fine. Continue.
Oh, okay. And so I realized this was a story that was just trapped within me, and I needed to say it, because I had lived through this war that nobody knew about. And that's very strange to go through your day-to-day life. You look normal. Everyone assumes you're just a normal girl. And yet you have this past, and that is within you and part of you also. So it was like this scream. I had to get it out of me. And so that's why I decided to start writing, because I also think it's very important there's many people who have difficult childhoods and who have struggled. And often we are taught by society, or we feel ashamed of it. And that was something that I certainly felt for a lot of years. I took responsibility for the actions of others onto my shoulders, even though I was the littlest one, and felt that it was a part of myself that I had to hide and wouldn't be accepted by the outside world. And that was a big reason why I wanted to write it, to say that we are not shaped by the trauma that we went through. Of course, it affects us, but that doesn't have to be the way the rest of your life goes. And it certainly doesn't have to be something we're ashamed of, because I don't like the word victim. I think survivor is a much better one. And it can give you skills that help you in life.
Yeah, and it's it's sort of like, I can't actually imagine having you being able to successfully write this book 10 years ago, because you must have been living those experience changes. It changes as you get older, and you can process them, and you're so close to something that like it takes a while for that distance to resolve itself into like understanding. So I'm glad it took you so long, because you probably have a more sort of clearer vision of how all these pieces fall into place. But on that note, this story is ongoing, in the sense that, for those of you who haven't read it, Cheryl's father was sort of the driving force behind a lot of the things, the movement in the book, the need to escape, the need to hide, the need to, the participation in criminal activity. But your father is still alive, I gather, and so this story didn't end with the publication of this book. It sort of enters a new chapter, I would think, right? Or how do you feel
Yes.
about that?
It's something I thought about a lot, and some of my friends were very concerned about me writing a book, because I haven't had contact with him for 10 years since I escaped. But I assume he's still out there somewhere, and he is a very dangerous and violent person, as you see in the book. Mm-hmm. So it was something that concerned me at the beginning, but then I realized that I didn't want to live my life in that kind of fear anymore, and that sooner or later you have to break this cycle that continues often for generations, of people being scared to stand and just tell the truth, or to tell their story as it truly is. And so that's why I decided to go ahead with writing my book, despite the risk of what might happen to me now that it's out. And because to me it's worth it to have been to have made it, to have been free. It's even whatever happens, I'll deal with the consequences of it. And it was worth it to be free.
So I can imagine, this actually is quite a point of interest for me. You have to change details. You obviously changed your family members' names. Does that give you a little bit of freedom and a distance to sort of write about them? Was it weird? I mean, it must be so strange to, obviously your family changed their names a lot too, in your childhood, but was it sort of a nice tool to be able to work with, that you can't really quite address them specifically?
No, it felt very close to home. It felt I could have named them anything and it would have still torn at my heart while I was writing it, for sure. And especially because, as you mentioned, I was used to them having many different names.
Yeah.
So I also don't identify people in general by their name, which is interesting.
Okay.
Because of the way I grew up, people are who they are. They're the feeling they give me. They're the sum of their personality and their quirks. I don't relate people to their name.
Right.
So it still felt extremely immediate and emotionally fraught for me while writing, for sure.
And was it hard to have certain things about your childhood that you felt that you couldn't write about in the book, or that you had to skim over, or was it, because obviously, people are alive. There's the threat of litigation, and especially in print, you can say whatever you want, a talk, but like when it's in print, there's always this idea, that you have to, if someone's alive, if they're dead, you can say literally whatever you want. How is that feeling like?
I don't think you can necessarily say whatever you want if they're dead, because it can still affect other people in the circle of the story. I was able to luckily include pretty much everything in the book.
Okay.
There was one scene which I had to cut because, which I understand, because the legal team at my publisher thought it was too explosive. And so that is something that in the book I address by talking around it. So the reader will understand that something is there, but I unfortunately had to cut the full scene. And yes, that was very difficult because it feels, at the time, now I'm at peace with it because I see that it's still, I think the feeling and the understanding still comes through. But at the time, it felt like I had worked so hard to write my story and write the truth. And then just at the last minute, it felt like I couldn't. And that was the whole reason I spent a decade of my life, which by then was a third of my life, writing this book. So
Oh boy.
it wasn't, yeah, it's when you put it into that perspective, it hit me very hard. But now, I'm very proud of the book, and I think I was able to communicate everything that I wanted, and everything except that scene is in the book. So yeah.
I think
It's
readers will know
fun.
what scene you're talking about when they read it. It's sort of clear, and also the sense that like the unknowingness of exactly what happened does come across, and it's a lot of the sort of the horror does come across in the sense of like lack of clarity. So I
Mhm.
think, there's a sort of sense of like terror and like, no one's ever entirely sure what's going on in general too. And in the book, you don't know that you never have a clear sense of the picture. So I don't think anything is lost though, and also the sense that there is a sense of you're protecting certain aspects does bring the reader into like complicity with like how dangerous things were. It sort of works to your advantage. Like when I edit celebrity memoirs, or when someone's suddenly spilling this whole truth, you're like, oh, could it have been that bad? You're just like out here telling me this. So this idea that there's a little bit of withholding furthers the sort of message.
Ah,
And I thought,
okay.
for my critical hat. So I was gonna say something that's a little funny. Probably should have told you this before. I was reading your book, and if you've all read it, there's a whole. It's just like completely, almost to the point of unbelievable, everything that happens there. And I was reading it, and you get to Israel, and I was like, okay, I know exactly what's going to happen in the scene. And I was like, I can't imagine having this childhood. I can't imagine anything. And then I was like, I can't imagine any part of my life intersecting with Cheryl's life, except that I was there at the Maccabea Games, at the bridge collapse when
Really?
your brother was waiting to march in. Yeah, so I know I was reading the scene and I was like, I know exactly what's going to happen. This is 1996, and this is Israel, and I was on
That's
the. I
amazing.
know. I was like, this is so insane because this book is so. The whole point is no one can imagine this, and I was like, I have been at this moment, and it was so exact. So there's a during the Maccabea Games in 1996, all the athletes were corralled in this big pen, and we're waiting to march in. And my grandparents were in the Ramat Gan Stadium. And you're in Israel, you lived in Israel, you're always on edge, like something's going to happen, right? Especially
Yes,
if you're an
yes.
outsider, especially. And suddenly, like, we're not marching in, and we can see the fireworks going off, and there's like all these like helicopters and police sirens, and we thought it was a terrorist attack. And you
Yes,
portray it
everyone
so well,
did.
the unknowingness of what had happened to your brother. The truth was a bridge collapsed on the way in to the stadium, and a bunch of athletes passed away then and later. And I remember trying to call my parents. I couldn't get on a cell phone, but I was so shocked that that's in print. It's like one of the biggest stories of my childhood was being there at that moment.
It's amazing that you were there and we intersect now all these
I
years later.
know. I know. I thought that was so
That's
crazy.
bizarre. That was a terrifying night. My gosh.
Oh, I know. It was chaos. It took them forever to figure out what had happened, and what had happened
And
was really
then even when they
strange.
had figured it out, they
Yeah.
didn't let the families know, even the ones who died. Yeah.
I know. And they had the whole opening ceremony went on without any athletes in the stadium. Which is
Yeah.
also a little bit strange. But anyway, it was so great. And then I was trying to think of if I had met your brother, because like we were all at the marketplaces trading clothes, and like I did have a Brazilian squash jersey, but not, so I was trying to figure that out. But it was,
Wow.
yeah, it was really strange. But I think
That
that's a
gives
really
me goosebumps.
doesn't it? I know.
It
I
really
feel,
does. Wow.
and I felt like that's such a great thing in this book because as I hate talking about memoir in the sense that when you say wildly imagined, because it's all real, but there's so much stuff here that in that moment for me as a reader was like, but these people are in your life, and they are, your childhood is, as you said, intersecting with kids in Virginia and athletes who might travel to other countries, and you're living this sort of really different life, but among people who are unaware of that. And that comes across so well. in the book. I wanted to tell people to write questions to put them in the chat, so we can ask those too. And don't forget to buy the book. This is not your first memoir. You wrote a memoir about being a model, right? First.
Yes, and that was even more bizarre time to write a memoir because I was a teenager. So if people think I'm too young to write a memoir now, I did that when I was a teenager.
Are you working on anything else now? Or are you taking a little break?
I'm taking about a month just to focus on publicizing Nowhere Girl, and also come down a little from that all that work it took.
Yeah, and also it's really different. I write novels, I talk about them. I love them, but it's not like having to relive my life in public like all the time. And that must be absolutely exhausting.
It was. I mean, yeah. I'm so glad that I didn't know how difficult it would be before I started writing Nowhere Girl. Mm-hmm. I'm very glad, because I thought that in a few years I could summarize the story, but as it turned out, I needed a lot more time to even truly understand the story and to understand how I wanted to write it, because there's many different ways you can approach a story like mine as well.
Yeah.
So it's good sometimes we can't see the future, because I think there's many things we wouldn't start if we knew how difficult they would be.
And you're obviously back in touch with your mother, which just happens in the book. And how does she feel about it?
So we have a very lovely relationship, and she was very encouraging actually from the beginning when I told her that it was something that I had started writing. And she said, I remember this clearly, she said, good. She said, you write it, you write everything, you write exactly how it was. And don't worry how I look in it, because she says, I know I've made a lot of mistakes as a mother, and there were many times I wasn't there for you. Write it. And that's something I really admire about her, that the truth means a lot to her more than looking good. And that makes her a very cool person.
That is awesome. I mean, she comes across as someone also under the spell of somebody else, she was
very much under my father's control and in deep fear. For a good reason.
And it just seems that also something that starts out to seem like a magical adventure turns into, what can you do? Just in the sense, normal people stay, not normal, not your mom's not normal, people in bad marriages stay with them to be with their kids, it's sort of, but that is really great.
If she left, he would have never let her see us kids again.
Yeah.
So she didn't have much of a choice. Yeah.
Well, also she probably doesn't want to leave you alone with your dad to run the show, so that didn't seem like an option for her. So maybe she did the best she could. I mean, she does seem to have done the best she could. Obviously, this, I live in LA. It's the question everyone gets asked. I think it's a dumb question, but in this case, I think it's a really good question. I can imagine people are really interested in seeing this on the screen somewhere. Have people been banging down your door?
Yes, that has begun.
Yeah, that's
very
great.
Flattering. Sure.
Yeah, it is cool.
Yeah, it's very flattering. And I think from the beginning, people were telling me that this memoir, even the way I write, is actually quite cinematic, because I write in a very fast-paced way. So you feel like you are living it in the moment, almost as if you're seeing it visually, or at least that's what I hope. And so, yes, there has been interest. As of the moment, I haven't decided on anything yet.
What I think something you do that makes it cinematic but also really great is that you get in and out of scenes very quickly without a lot of to do, and that sort of mimics the sort of frantic pace of your childhood. But also, as a reader, sometimes writers feel like we need to see everything. We need to sit down to dinner and see the whole meal, and then the getting on the airplane and the buckling the seatbelt. It's like, no, you do such a great job of moving us through time and space without sacrificing the dramatic quality of what's happening in those scenes.
Yeah, that was also a practical decision.
Because there's a lot.
The first draft of this book was actually 800 pages.
Whoa, that's a lot.
Yes, and so I spent the last 3 years of working on my book, wasn't writing it, it was editing it from 800 pages to the current length, which is 300. And to try and figure out a way of keeping the whole story and all the momentum and the excitement and danger within and yet have it still make sense. That was like this puzzle in my mind that took me 3 years of moving and cutting and rearranging. And so I also learned and taught myself how to move myself and the reader in and out of scenes extremely quickly, because that was my only option. I had to fit the whole story into a much smaller space than what I actually kind of needed. And it was very difficult, but it really honed my skills of writing in a fast-paced way where I still hope it doesn't feel like you're ever being rushed or you're ever missing any information. That was my hope in the editing process.
You know, it's one of the hardest things to do as a writer. I teach creative writing, and it's just people think we need to see the whole room all the time. We need to,
No,
you know, you just need
sometimes
the
it's better
essential.
not
Yeah,
to.
I agree.
Sometimes
I
it's
can't
better
see
not to.
I can't see if there are any questions because it says chat disabled on my screen. So if anyone has questions, I'm not exactly sure where they're coming.
Look down, Ivy, where the
It says,
ask a question. Do you see that on your screen?
no, mine says chat disabled. I don't know why.
You don't have
Oh
a
yeah, if
ask a
you
question?
click on ask a question, there's some
I
there.
Mine, okay. Oh, there we go. Sorry, it's just in black and white. I mean, it's just on my, it doesn't say ask a question. Okay. I am going to ask the questions. Can you both share a little bit about what your lives and writing lives have been like during the pandemic and this past weird year? I'm going to let Cheryl take that one because our lives have probably been slightly different and hers is probably more exciting than mine. So,
Well, during the pandemic, it wasn't that exciting at all. That the 2020 was not my year. I don't think it was anyone's year, but it was in reality a very difficult one for me because I was under a very strict deadline to finish the book, and I had been working pretty much without any break for 10 years on it. I hadn't, I'd written another book in the meantime as well, Naked Rome, but I was severely burning out last year. And I just didn't want to edit this story anymore or see this story anymore because it was just too much, right?
right.
And it's already difficult to write something so deeply personal, but to have to keep going in and editing. And then I got the news that scene had to be taken out, which was very important to me. And so let's just put it this way. 2020 was a big disaster for me emotionally. I did not weather it well, especially at the beginning. Now looking back, I can see, of course, you always look back on these times and then you can see that it was important, I think, for me to go through and for me to address any of these lingering feelings I had about or what I was carrying from my past. So it turned out to be good. But when I look back at 2020, I still don't even want to think about it because I remember struggling a lot and feeling very isolated because I was in quarantine in Luxembourg because I'd gone there to visit my mother and ended up being stuck there for 7 months.
Oh.
And so I was far away from my friends and the place that really feels like home to me. And that was also very reminiscent to me of my childhood, which didn't help the thing of being torn away from the base that you've built. So in many ways, yes.
I could also imagine being in Italy, because where you lived during the pandemic would also have been presented another host of challenges in Luxembourg.
Oh, I think every place and for everyone last year was a challenge for sure. And hopefully one that we learned from, that we spent more time with ourselves and had to deal with our issues a little bit more. So in the end, it did help me.
I spent a lot of time with my 6-year-old. That's my answer to that question. So I know a lot about her issues, many of which I have to resolve for her. Cheryl, no, right. That's my writing life, was like, we learned like basic, we learned what a noun was, that's where I am. I learned addition and parts of speech. Cheryl, is there a special kind of wisdom that comes from having lived such an unusual life?
Yes, I think so. And it's something that I have learned to appreciate only with time and with distance from my story. Especially having written it all out now, I can really zoom out and see that I think pain often brings a lot to you if you can find a way to go through the pain without letting yourself become jaded or hard or angry. Because I was definitely angry for a lot of years because of what they did to me and because of the disaster that my family left me to clean. And I realized during the years I was angry, my life was still a disaster, even though I had escaped, but I was carrying it all with me into my life. And I saw that the only person I was taking down was myself. Mm-hmm. And during the time that I wrote this book, it helped me. Just at some point, I realized I have to let go of the anger bit by bit until it's totally gone, because I'll never have a good life or a free life if I'm still hanging on to these stories and to the people who hurt me. Because in the end, if you tie yourself to them, that's what anger is. It's like a rope that binds you to the very people that you thought you'd escaped. So,
I had a question about something that's not. So you wrote, obviously you wrote a memoir about being a model when you were younger, 19. You wrote it at 19. And then some of that stuff is touched on in Nowhere Girl. Did it feel different to write about were you processing that experience of modeling differently in the second go round of writing about it? Or did you kind of have the same opinion?
For sure, because when I started writing Model when I was 17, and I finished it when I was 19, or almost 20. And so at the time I was very much still in the modeling industry. That's what I did all day. And then I would write my book at night.
Right.
And now, of course, with the extra time on my side, it also seems like a smaller portion of my life than it did back then, because back then that was, and especially when you're a teenager, you see whatever you're doing at that particular time as this big thing. And now I saw that it was almost a very small portion of this huge adventure that I didn't even realize was such an adventure back then, because back then I thought the modeling was more interesting than my life story. And now I see that the modeling was the most normal thing I've ever done, actually.
That and sport, you did a lot of sports too, which are kind of part of a normal childhood, except that your father was pretty extreme about his pressure on you guys, which is sort of, you did gymnastics, and that's a big story these days, is the pressure on female gymnasts. Do you still think about that and your time doing sports and gymnastics? And how do you must see like this change in the sport, and a lot of the truth have been, uncovered recently.
Yeah, it's a very difficult sport. And if I had a child, I wouldn't want them ever to feel obligated to perform at that kind of a level.
Yeah.
Unless it was something, obviously, that they truly wanted to do, because when I began gymnastics, it was something that I had a lot of fun doing. But as soon as I started to get better at it, then all the expectations and the pressure were on me, because everyone expected me to go to the Olympic, and I did go to the Junior Olympics for gymnastics. It's a lot of pressure on a child, which naturally, of course, drains the pleasure out of something that you used to really love, right? And I see that it, though, gave me certain things which still benefit me a lot in my life, even as a writer, for example, the discipline I learned from training 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, every day as a very young kid. And the ability to focus on one thing and see it through is, I think I probably wouldn't have been able to see my book through if it wasn't for these skills that were given to me, one, by the very intense sports training that I did, and two, also by my father, by my family, by the very people who then later betrayed me. But they also gave me skills that I see now in my life, how they benefit me and help me actually pursue my dream now.
It's funny, I write a lot about like how being a professional athlete was actually a really good companion piece to being a writer, and I did both at the same time, because they are the same discipline. And you only have yourself to blame. They can both be incredibly rewarding. But the one thing that was always so funny, I always thought about writing in sports, is like in writing, like the outcome is so far in the future. And in sports, although you train all the time, you can like do the competition, and it's like that day you can see whether it's good or bad. And like writing is like I find the discipline, the practice the same, but that moment of like satisfaction is delivered so differently. And I think that's why for me, in my mind, they go really well together. You must have been very tall for gymnastics. That must have been painful in a certain way.
That
you do talk
is the
about
reason
that.
I had to stop, because now I'm 5'11".
Yeah. Whoa.
And yeah.
That's
I grew very tall, but the time I went to the Junior Olympics, I was 12, almost 13. And so I hadn't had my growth spurt yet.
Okay.
And I was training so many hours a day that also stunts your growth.
Right.
And so it was by the time that I was 13 that I quit. And then I had a massive growth spurt. Wow. And I remember my knees and my elbows, like all my joints really hurting. And it was a year after that I started modeling, because it just
shot up.
I shot up. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then kept growing.
I did gymnastics till I was in like 8th grade, and I was like 5'3" by then. It was just like everything hurt. You couldn't I just couldn't rotate around fast enough. Yeah, that was not good.
So hard when you're tall. It really is. Yeah.
I think we have time for like 2 more questions. Let's see. What are you reading and listening to and doing these days?
Well, the book that I'm really enjoying now is Memoirs of Hadrian.
Okay.
By Marguerite Yourcenar. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. And it's this very fascinating look into the mind of this emperor and his thoughts on life as delivered from when he is dying. But he's looking back on his life and the things he accomplished with the regrets and he's giving advice almost to someone younger. He's writing it in the form of a letter to someone younger who he cares about. And I find that one to be a very beautiful book. And then I'm listening to music, because I don't usually listen to audiobooks so often. I like the feeling of having a real book in my hands.
I'm the same way. There's sometimes when there's something I don't want to read and I don't want to waste time, I like listen to it, but then I realize it takes so much longer. I'm like, wait, this book's going to take like 19 hours. Like, I should have just read it. I have to review a book, and I had to read this other book that I didn't want to read. And I've been listening to it. I'm like, I would have been done with this in like a day. I was just like hour 7 of 12. It's just really a nightmare. Okay, any more of these questions that we should ask? I think we asked all of these, but so do you think do you have, I know you're taking a break from writing, but is there a project you're thinking of working on? I mean, do you think you would ever write I actually want to know, do you think you'll ever write fiction? Is there just enough nonfiction floating and experiences in your brain that's where it goes?
Well, yeah, I have a lot of material in the nonfiction category, that's for sure. It's interesting talking to one of my best friends today about whether I would write fiction or not. And he was encouraging me about that. I think that whatever fiction I will write, if I do, it would, of course, I'm sure, be based very much on fact. I've had a lot of varied experiences, and I think we always do write from some base of knowledge that we already have, and then we could imagine from there. I don't know yet. I'm gonna see what inspires me in the coming months.
Well, you could put the part of your book that was exorcised into fiction if it felt anyway sort of cathartic to get it back into print.
That's an interesting idea. That would be a very heavy piece of fiction for sure.
I can imagine. Yeah. So, well, I hope you do write some fiction, because your style is so propulsive and it really lends itself to, both nonfiction and fiction. But I think it would be just awesome to read something else from you.
Agreed. I think whatever you write next is going to be brilliant. So we can't wait to read it. And I'm just curious about what is Rome like these days? Is it okay?
It's hot.
Yeah.
So is Brooklyn. So.
Good. I can't wait. I had the air conditioner off because it makes a little bit of sound.
Oh my God, me too.
Me three.
Well, now we all.
I have this.
We're all just sweating.
I have this handy. Anyway, thank you so much for your support of indie bookstores. Thank you for being with us.
Okay.
It turned out that both of you have some really interesting synchronicities in your lives.
I know, which is such a surprising thing to come together over this particular
right,
book,
right.
So,
That blew my mind. That's really amazing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you to everyone watching. Please remember, you can order the book right here on the screen, but you can also come into any of our bookstores and we have it there as well. So thank you, and I hope to see you in person someday soon.
Bye, guys.
Okay?
Thanks so much. Stay cool there in Rome.
Hey.
Bye, everyone.
And in Miami.
Bye.